Welcome to Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. The Way of Life. Being. Notes of lectures delivered in Scandinavia, 1904. By J. Boyd. Revised. London, G. Morrish, 20, Paternoster Square. 1906. The Promise of Life, 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 1. I wish to speak a few words on the expression we get in this verse. The promise of life which is in Christ Jesus. The apostle brings before us the failure that had already come into the profession of Christianity. And in chapters 3 and 4 the failure that was about to come in the last days. He speaks in chapter 3 of the coming in of perilous times, and in chapter 4 of the time when they would not endure sound doctrine. It is a dark picture that is drawn by the Spirit of God of that which professes the name of Christ, but when everything in the profession fails we see how the apostle falls back upon that which is incorruptible. Life which is in Christ Jesus. Every kind of evil may creep into the profession of the name of Christ, but that which is in Christ abides in its own purity forever. This life in Christ was no mere remedy for the ruin of the creature, it was God's thought for man before the world was. So when everything was fast lapsing into decay, the apostle can fall back upon this. In Romans he speaks of himself as an apostle separated to the gospel of God, but here life is what occupies him in his service as an apostle. I suppose life really lies in the ability to enjoy the relationships in which we are placed. It is so as to the natural order, we are set in certain relationships, and affections have been created in us by God which enable us to enjoy these relationships. The relationships would be intolerable had we not the affections that belong to them. No one would desire to be in close relationship with one for whom he had no affection. Adam loved God in the way in which he knew him, not as the believer loves God, for we love him according to the revelation he has been pleased to make of himself in Christ. But Adam loved him as his beneficent creator, and had he continued in innocency he would have continued in the enjoyment of the place he had with God, and all his innocent race along with him. But when sin came in, fear took the place of love in the heart, and the relationship became intolerable, and as to men, hateful and hating one another took the place of love one to another. In the mercy of God a certain amount of natural affection has been preserved, otherwise the world could not exist. When you come to Christ you come to another order of man, and in that man you come to new relationships and to new affections. Christ, having accomplished the work of redemption, sends Mary with a message, in which is brought to light the new order of relationships for man in connection with him. He says, Go to my brethren, and say to them, I ascend to my Father, and your Father, and to my God, and your God. In these words we learn the blessedness of the new order. Into the old order sin came and death followed, and the thing that makes death so terrible is that it is the breakup of all the sweet and tender relationships in which man finds himself in the present life. Because of this death is dreaded. But the new order never can be invaded by sin, and therefore the relationships are inviolable by death. Love, the nature of God and the nature of his children, never fails. This is the life of all that have part in the new order, for this is really the life of Christ. The relationships are new and the affections are new also, and the affections are divine. It is not only that God has created these affections in our hearts, but they are of his nature. Love is of God, and he that loves is born of God and knows God. It was not so in the old order, though of course God created the affections which belong to it, but they are human affections, not divine, but in the new order everything is divine. Those I address here this evening are not, except in a few cases, related to one another in the flesh, but we are all brethren in Christ, and also sons of God in Christ Jesus. And we have the affections that enable us to enjoy these holy and eternal relationships. And this is the sphere of life, and we know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren. In the old order we are always very conscious that we are in a scene of death, and the stronger our natural affections are the more we realize that it is a scene of death. A husband fears that he may lose his wife, and the wife dreads the loss of her husband. Parents fear that death will come in and rob them of their children, and children fear to lose their parents. And all this keeps us constantly in mind that death lies upon everything in the old order. But in the new order we are beyond the reach of death. Everything in the new order is of God. This does not mean simply that he created it. This was true of the old, it was God's creation, but in the new everything is of him in the sense that it is of his nature. Adam was the workmanship of God. He was formed out of the dust of the ground and made a living soul by the breath of God. But the new man is formed by the light of God in Christ, brought into the soul by the power of the Spirit. And failure can never come in here. And upon this living and imperishable rock Paul falls back when he sees everything going to decay here in the profession of Christianity. And this was the eternal thought of God for man. The first Adam came upon the scene 4,000 years before the last was revealed, but the last Adam was first in the counsels of God. The old relationships and affections were upon earth before the new, but the new were in the mind of God for man before the world was. And when the old will have disappeared as a vision of the night, the new will be found blooming in fadeless glory to the praise of God forever. We need to know these things better than we do, especially in a day when we see things around us going steadily to the bad. And it is only as we get to see the mind of God for us in connection with what is ours in Christ that we shall be able to set ourselves steadfastly to build up our souls in the love of God, knowing that it is in divine love our life lies, and here death cannot enter. I could understand a saint saying, I do not see how I can be said to be beyond the reach of death, for I may die and be separated from the love of the brethren. But death cannot separate you from the love of God, and as to the love of the brethren, the Lord will raise up both you and them at his coming again. In the meantime you are with Christ, and you cannot call that death. What a comfort all this was to the heart of the apostle in the presence of the ruin, to retire upon that which is indestructible. Everything committed to the responsibility of man goes to the bad, but the things in Christ abide to eternity, and we require to be better established on the line of life when we see the profession depart from Christ.